this idea, this phrase, has a bunch of assumptions going on underneath it, and what we want to do is learn a new tool for how to look at these assumptions and kind of take them apart and see what's going on underneath it. Like Grace very helpfully said in the beginning, most of us have the experience of wearing sunglasses all day, or maybe you wear like prescription glasses all day, and maybe you've been wearing them all day, and you kind of forgot you had them on, so you don't really see the glasses anymore, you just see the world, and the world's kind of oranger than it used to be. You know, maybe your skin's a little pinker when you look at yourself, and then you take them off, and you're like, oh, I didn't actually get that much of a sunburn after all. Or maybe if you're like me, you forget to clean your glasses all day, and you didn't realize how smudged they were until you take them off, and you're like, oh, that's why I have a headache. So these lenses, we stop paying attention to the way they work and where they are and what we're looking through, and instead just see the world. And we want to start paying attention to what lenses we're wearing, because like Grace said, you don't want to wear sunglasses in a dark room. You don't want to wear your reading glasses to look far, maybe not to drive, certainly. And by paying attention to these glasses, we can start seeing and using them, because some of them are really useful in some situations, but not in others, and some of them are just downright harmful. So this tool, this word queer, we believe in context, and we're about paying attention to context. So we want to give you some context to the word queer, because like we said, there's a big diversity. Is queer an ugly word? What does it mean? It's very confusing. So our first written ideas of the word queer come from about 1520. It was usually just like an adjective, like, oh, a queer smell, which didn't mean like good. It was a bad, funky smell. Or something was done queerly meant kind of badly, oddly, like off-kilter, not quite right, not quite square, you know? Not really used to apply to people at all, just, you know, other things in the world. It became associated with gay folk beginning in the 20th century, turn of the 20th century. This is Gertrude Stein. She, 90 years before anyone else, started referring to herself as a queer woman. It didn't really catch on. Except that it started being associated with gay folk in a negative way, sort of colloquially. And by the 1970s, it was used primarily as a slur, mostly by people we would consider straight, toward people we would consider trans or gay in some way. This was a way of defining other people, and it was usually used in scare quotes, right? Like a queer bar, a queer guy, a queer group of people. It was a way of saying, there is a way the world is. We're talking about lenses. The lenses are, men are masculine and they like women, and women are feminine and they like men, and people outside of that are abnormal. They're queer, they're odd, they're eccentric, they smell bad. You know, that's bad. That's abnormal. And it was used to define people, to dehumanize them, to say they aren't living into this idea, this lens, so I can't see them as co-equal with me. In the 1980s, things were pretty dark in a lot of what we would call gay areas, because AIDS was running rampant on New York and San Francisco. There was an organization called ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So AIDS was wiping out people. People were becoming infected, they were dying, they didn't know why, they didn't know what it was, they didn't know who was carrying it, how it was spread, how far it would go, how fast it would act, would it ever stop, or we were going to figure this out. And so these groups who had been talking about, you know, queerness and gayness, and it was kind of this thing that you just did on the side, it wasn't really talked about much. They realized like, this homophobia, this silence, was killing people, because the government wasn't allocating funds to figure out what was happening. Municipalities weren't doing awareness campaigns. You know, there wasn't organizations, hospitals who were refusing to treat these people. So it was like, hello, I think there's someone in the back. So we have these people who just like, they took over the New York Stock Exchange. They took over Grand Central Station. And they said, every 8 minutes someone is infected with AIDS, pay attention. People are dying, pay attention. You know, if I die of AIDS, forget burial, just drop my body on the steps of the FDA. Pay attention, we matter. And we may be queer, and you might not think that we matter or that we're good, but we're dying, and we are God's children, and it matters. They might have not mentioned God's children, but that's mine. So in the 1990s, reclaiming the word queer. So a lot of these organizations, Queer Nation, kind of grew out of some of the ACT Out, or ACT UP activist alumni, if you will. So they said, actually, the ugliness of this word queer is just as disarming as taking over the New York Stock Exchange. The ugliness of this word queer says, yeah, I'm queer, pay attention. Yeah, I'm queer, and it matters. Yeah, I'm queer, and it's okay. if the status quo means death, if the status quo means racism, if the status quo means misogyny, if the status quo means homelessness, if the status quo means that people can just die and we don't care, then I would rather be queer. Yeah, I'm queer. It's okay. That brings us to today, because in this reclaiming of the word, this word that meant odd or eccentric, this word that was meant to dehumanize, to say they are not like us, us is what matters, they are them, and we don't like them. It was saying, actually, that word is meant to dehumanize me, but that word, queer, I'm doing things queerly, I am queer, I am going to use it to affirm my humanity. And in this way, they looked at the foundations of the word and said, what do we keep? What do we throw away? Well, we're going to keep that it's odd. We're going to keep that it's different. We're going to keep that it dissolves ideas and say that's okay. So this brings us to today. There's three main uses of the word queer today. One's kind of a catch-all phrase for LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or quilt bag, which is new to me. I heard a new one called quilt bagpipe, which adds 4 more letters. Yeah, so alphabet soup, it gets kind of unwieldy. It's hard to say these not-so-fun acronyms. So queer becomes useful because it's shorthand. Some people just use it as shorthand to mean quilt bag or LGBT. Some people like it because it dissolves binary categories. So I can self-identify. I'm transgender. I'm transgender, genderqueer, and queer. So when somebody says, "Are you gay?" Genderqueer means I don't identify as male or female. So I'm like, maybe. I may be gay. I am not entirely certain. Who are you asking me if I'm attracted to? Let's be honest. Because that's what you're asking, and I don't know what it means. So a lot of these, like homosexual and heterosexual, are terms predicated on the idea, they're built on the idea that there are 2 sexes. And I kind of fall outside of that boundary, so I wouldn't even know what to tell you if you asked me if I was gay. I wouldn't know what to tell you if you asked me if I was a lesbian. So it's useful because it dissolves boundaries. It says, you know, this assumption behind this word homosexual, I don't know if it works for me. The way we're mainly going to be using it today is this is kind of an academic, pretty confusing use of the word. It's a political viewpoint that questions the assumptions that we take for granted. Those are the lenses, right? So when it's meant to look at the foundations of something, it can be anything, an idea, a law, a painting, you know, a song, a phrase like no purpling, and decide what we want, what we don't want, what we want to keep, what we want to play with, what we think is fun, what we think is useful. That's confusing. 2 examples. So there's a character in British literature, Sherlock Holmes' universe, John Watson. He's brilliant, he's compassionate, he's really thoughtful, he's very loyal. He serves as Sherlock Holmes' conscience, social grace, because Sherlock Holmes doesn't really have any. And that's important. And in literature, he's also a white guy. And he's been a white guy in almost every iteration of the Sherlock Holmes universe that's been reimagined. So recently, the show Elementary, I can imagine the writers in a room going, okay, what's important about John Watson? What's important about Watson, this character? Okay, loyal, brave, thoughtful, really smart, has a social conscience, you know, that's important. White guy. You know, I don't think that's that important. So they cast Lucy Liu, who's awesome in this role, if you've not seen her. And they decided to call the role Joan Watson. That's queering the role. That's queering Watson. They said, what's important? What do we want to keep? What's good? What's useful? What's not useful? What work would it do in the world if we changed this? What could it change? We can also do this with the Bible. So, are we familiar with the story of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, perhaps? Maybe the musical? Yes. Yeah? Okay. So, Joseph, I'm going to call Joseph Joe. And I'm going to use they pronouns for Joe. Joe had a lot of brothers. They didn't really like Joe. Joe had some dreams about upsetting the social order, like having sheaves of wheat bowing down to theirs, you know? That stars in the sky were reorienting themselves. That Joe's brothers would one day bow down to them. And their brothers didn't really like that. Joe also asked their father for what we see as a Technicolor coat, a coat of many patches, something beautiful, a garment. In Hebrew, the word means dress. It doesn't mean coat. Joseph's father loves Joe very much and gives them this coat, this dress. Joe wears it all the time and loves it. One day, Joe's brothers are kind of fed up with this whole situation and kind of They murder an animal, slather Joe's dress in blood, leave Joe in a hole, sell Joe to slavery, and tell Joe's father that they're dead. And Joe, through this connection with God, has these images and these visions and works with Pharaoh and interprets dreams and sees that a famine is coming and is put in charge of the management of Pharaoh's entire household. And famine does come, but Egypt is ready because of Joe. And when Joe's family comes and says, we're starving, we have to go to Egypt, let's get grain, they see Joe. They don't recognize him. That's interesting. So Joe, through some chicanery, tricks their family to getting their brother and their father there and says, I'm Joe. You know, I'm Joe, and I missed you. And to me, as a transgender person, I read this as a story of a trans feminine, genderqueer person who was shunned by their family, who was sent away, but who, through an incredible relationship with God, saved not just one nation, but many. Through this incredible love and connection they had, they lived into their identity. What does it mean that if the Hebrew says dress, we insist upon translating it as coat? What lenses are we wearing when we translate this? If it could mean dress, why don't we just say dress? Why do we make that decision? So the third use of the word queer, this is just my disclaimer, my plea to you, is that it's still used as a slur. There's still people that carry pain in this word. The best way I can explain that is, have you ever had like the stomach flu really bad, but before you got sick, you ate a food that you really liked, and then you got really sick, and then maybe 5-10 years later, you can still smell that food, it makes you feel kind of nauseous even though you used to like it? That's what carrying pain in a word is like. If you've only ever heard people use this word to assault you, whether physically or just verbally, I would say just verbally, verbal assault is assault. If you've only ever heard this word to dehumanize you, then someone else even using it to say, hey, no, you're queer, that's cool, can still hurt. So this is my plea to you. You don't get to identify other people as queer. The power of the word queer as an affirmation of life, as a humanizing element, comes from self-identification. It's our story to tell. And also, just if somebody asks you not to use it, don't. Just respect their pain. Just respect where people are with the word, and be careful what situations you bring it in, because you don't know what it's carrying it. You know, it could be loaded, it could not be. So no purpling. My question to you, pop quiz, using this idea, let's examine what's going on. What are the assumptions? What are the assumptions underneath? No purpling.
There are only two genders.
Yes.
That males and females have to be attracted to each other, not males and males and females and females. They have to purple.
Exactly. Okay, well that was quick. Good job. You passed your quiz. Yeah, so it assumes it's heterosexism to assume that everyone is straight. And it assumes that there are only two genders. It's a gender binary system or oppositional sexism. So for someone like me who sees this and is like, well, I already feel purple. You know, whereas if someone who's gay, that's not helpful at all. So what we're trying to do is just pay attention to these lenses and what they're doing, what work they're doing, and how we're using them.
And in the same way that Logan mentioned, we're going to be throwing around the word queer and kind of reclaiming that as was done in the 90s. Thanks for the history lesson, Logs. We're also going to be reclaiming the word purpling, because you may have noticed on our opening slide, no purpling, but God is purpling all the time. So when we're talking about God is queering, God is queer, God is destabilizing boundaries that we believe to be fixed, which is a definition that Logan just pulled out of his head that I think is brilliant, and we're going to keep coming back to. God is purpling, and maybe we're using purpling in an ugly way, but we can also, in this presentation, show you how that can be reclaimed through a clear lens. Okay, so God is God, right? Or is she? So we all make assumptions. If you don't think you make assumptions, you're wrong. So I assume, that's right. Whoa, meta. But where do these assumptions come from? And that's something that we want to be talking about today. So I'm going to need my friends here to get up, and we're going to do a little interactive skit about assumptions and how your how information that you might have access to will influence your assumptions. So Grace over there is standing and watching me, and Logan is watching Grace. I'm going to do something behind Logan's back, and Grace is going to try to communicate to Logan what I'm doing. Okay? You ready, Grace?
So she's moving her arms, she's dancing, kind of like stirring a pot.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, does anybody know the name of the dance that I was just doing? Cabbage Patch. Thank you. So, the only information that Logan was receiving about what I was doing was through Grace. That is, through the experiences, the assumptions, the interpretations that Grace was making of my actions. So if I had asked one of you brilliant folk, or perhaps somebody who was a bit older and was alive when the Cabbage Patch was a real hip move, they might have said something different. And that, just based on the fact that it's coming through, that information was coming through someone's perspective, that completely changed the fact, the information that Logan is receiving about what I was doing. Logan will never know how glorious that answer really was. So earlier today, we talked about a set of assumptions, or we talked about lenses. And in another way that I want to talk about a lens is a set of assumptions that you use to view the world. For instance, a lens that we might use when we talk about purpling is heterosexist, like that everyone is heterosexual and so purpling works and yay, there will be none of that. And so the lenses that we use also influence everything that we see. But when we're using these lenses, we need to question who gets to establish the lens, who gets to establish how you're seeing the world and why. That's what we're going to deconstruct. WTF is normal anyway. So let's talk about God, because we're here at a Christian youth event. And I will propose that we all see God through a lens as well. Me personally, I do believe in ultimate truth, and there is an ultimate existence of God, but as humans, there is a way in which we mediate seeing that truth in the world. For instance, why do we gender God as he? Why do we say he in services just this morning? Why is he used in the Bible? I'll answer that question for you. Probably because in the Greek and Hebrew of the Bible, the pronoun he is used, or the words are gendered as masculine singular. Sometimes masculine or female, never mind, I won't get into that. But sometimes they're gendered differently. Anyway, so who gets to define, who gets to choose God's pronouns? Does God say, he, God, hello, that's me, yes? Or is somebody else getting to gender God for God? So there are certain lenses that we use to examine the world. And based on what lens we use, that gets to establish what is normal and what's not normal. So raise your hand if when you were little, or maybe even now, you imagined God as this really big white guy with a beard sitting up in the clouds. Did anybody think of God that way? I did. Yes, the Lincoln statue, exactly, sitting in this massive throne. So where did that understanding come from? Was there a chapter in Genesis that I missed that was like, as God was sitting on his throne, stroking his long white beard, he said, Moses, hello? No, that's not anywhere in the Bible, right? So where did that come from? Normal, abnormal. We're going to use the term normative perspective. Normal meaning someone gets to define, like, what is okay and what's good, and then what's like, whoa, you're weird, you're out there, that's not right. And there are certain perspectives, certain normative perspectives that are given more credence and allowed to be more normal. Generally speaking, but it's getting better, we use a male lens, and generally a male straight lens, to see the world. So here we've got God chilling, and then we use a male lens for God. We use masculine pronouns. We allow our young children to internalize this idea of God as the Lincoln statue, thank you. And then we get this, Monty Python. And that's not okay, because anybody that does not fit into this normal, abnormal perspective, or normal perspective rather, is deemed abnormal and gets left out. And I personally don't believe in a God that's about that. So let's talk about this a little bit more. instead of using a straight male lens in this presentation, we're going to use a queer lens. And again, queer we're going to talk about as destabilizing boundaries that we believe to be fixed. So why are we saying that a straight male lens is more true than any other way to look at the Bible? Let's use the Bible because that's what I'm going to use. If we can justify any other lens by biblical evidence, through theology, through the nature of God, who God reveals God's self to be in creation, why is this lens less true or less normal than anything else? And finally, who gets to decide that? To whom are we giving power? Are we giving power to the people who society has given power to through just the way that history is played out? Or are we giving power to the creator of the universe and allowing that being to identify themselves? It's a rhetorical question. Okay, so we're just going to practice messing. Can you hold questions till the end? Just write it down so you don't forget it. We're going to have lots of time for lots of discussion and questions. Okay, so we're going to just practice queering, that is, disabling boundaries you believe to be fixed, just by switching up pronouns in the Magnificat, which I'm sure many of you have either heard sung, "My soul doth magnify," or just read it in morning prayer. So let's have, like, this side of the room, you're going to read this column, and then this side of the room, you're going to read this column. And as you're reading, I would implore you to notice what is happening as you are changing God's pronouns. Is it uncomfortable to you? Do you feel like you're talking to someone else, maybe? Does it feel sacrilegious? And hold that and carry that forward with you and wonder why those things would be happening to you. So let's go for it, left side.
My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, because she has regarded the lowliness of her handmaid. For behold, henceforth all generations shall call me blessed, because she who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is her name, and her mercy is from generation to generation for those who fear her. She has shown light with her arm. She has scattered the proud in the conceit of their heart. She has put down the mighty from their thrones, and has exalted the lowly. She has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich she has sent away empty. She has given help to Israel, her servant, mindful of her mercy, even as she spoke to our mothers, to Sarah and your posterity forever.
Thank you guys so much. That was just lovely. And so carrying this forward, here's an example of how we might queer or look at a prayer through a queer lens. Oh, well, that's a bold claim, but we're going to go with it. God is queer. And I'd like to talk about some examples in the Bible and in theology about why looking at God through this queer lens might reveal something new about the nature of God that you hadn't thought about until today. So without looking at the slide, can someone tell me the one way in which God identifies God's self in the Bible?
I can't see any of it, but isn't there the passage about Adam and Eve being created in his own image, and if you have a male and a female, how do you have one image?
Okay, that's more of a, okay, so this is God identifying God's self, making a claim about God's own identity. Go for it.
I am who I am.
I am who I am. Holla back. I'm going to get to that in just 1 second, though. Gold star, silver star. Just kidding. We're all get gold stars. So God, the only way in which God identifies God's self in the Bible is I am. He says Moses, yo, Moses, go back to those people and tell them I am sent you. Moses is like, okay, they're going to think I'm crazy. But that is the one way in which God identifies God's self. God doesn't say, hey, Moses, tell them that me, God, this dude with a beard, said, go do this. No, God totally obliterates any categories by which humans are identifying themselves. God does not gender God's self. God does not give any physical attributes, which, when looking through a queer lens, opens up the possibilities of ways in which humans are forced to force one another to categorize ourselves.
I also want to say, like, that was in this historical, critical, contextual period. That's weird.
Mm-hmm.
That's just really weird for God not to give a name, not to give a gender,
not to give a graven image,
or like a tribal affiliation. Like there's a tribal affiliation in that part of the story, but like for God not to be like, I'm just I'm this one, I'm named this is what I do, this is what I'm God of. It's just, I am. Or another translation, I will be what I will be.
Thank you, Logan. And so maybe at this point you're thinking, thank you for anticipating that. So there's that time in Genesis where God was like, but male and female, we created them male and female, in my image, male and female. Just says male and female a bunch of times. And this is in the Genesis creation story. But what else? So that's one way of looking at it. That might be, okay, well, there's two genders, right? But if we're looking at it through a queer lens, we get freed up a bit. What else does God create in the beginning, along with human beings?
Light. Trees.
Light and dark, yes. I heard elephants, great. Water, good. What else?
Land.
Land, okay, cool. So God is creating all this crazy stuff. And let's use the examples of light and darkness and earth and sea. So we've got light and darkness, we've got the land and the sea. But what is in between all of these things? What's in between day and night? Dusk, twilight, dawn, noonday. And if we're creating earth and water, we've got estuaries, bays, Bay Area, shout out. Swamps. There's so much creation and diversity amidst these things that we believe to be at two opposite poles. If we have that as a model for creation, why not gender as well? So in this way, if we're looking at the creation story through a queer lens, we're seeing that based on the world that God created to us and is revealing to us every day, this God is not asking us, well, you can either be a bagel or a donut. You're either this or that. But rather, there is an infinite multiplicity of existences that live in between those two seemingly fixed boundaries. Okay, let's look at another nature of God. Trinity. Okay, so somebody raised their hand, Bishop, I might be calling on you, to explain to me exactly how the Trinity works. Go for it.
Okay, so it's like they're all one thing that's then divided into three separate things.
Right, oh, it's like one thing that's all the same, but it's like three completely different things and also the same thing, but totally different at the same time.
So it's like the three rivers in Pittsburgh. So like everything's in the center, and then it separates into the Ohio River and whatever other rivers there are there.
Cool, okay, that's a great analogy. Anybody else? Anybody? Bueller? Okay, so this really foundational theological understanding of the nature of God that our church has a cool Sunday to celebrate, this back a few Sundays ago, is completely incomprehensible. It's crazy. It's really, really hard to understand. In fact, I would venture to say that for a long time humans have been trying to figure out, and we really haven't gotten the perfect analogy yet. And that's cool. Maybe some of you have been in Trinity Sunday or heard a sermon where priests are talking about the Trinity and they're like, oh, people, the Trinity is just crazy, don't worry about that. Like, let's talk about Amos. This person's much more easy to understand. Why are people so afraid of the Trinity? It's because it's hard. It destabilizes our understanding of who God is. If we're thinking about God as Abraham Lincoln sitting up in the sky, we can't possibly meld these two things. You end up like that guy over there. But if we're looking to the nature of who our church history and who our theology is telling us that God is, we can't possibly believe in a God that's anything but queer. That's a bold claim. That was an I statement. You can believe in whatever God you want. I cannot possibly believe in a God who would be anything but totally dissolved with boundaries. And thirdly, who God picks for her team. So let's say, like, if God were playing dodgeball, God would pick all of the shrimps, the uncoordinated people, all of the people who like totally forgot their gym outfit and were just like, whatever, I don't care. Probably would have picked me. For her team. And that is totally crazy. That's not, you wouldn't expect the ultimate power of the universe to choose to call these people who everyone else in society was like, yeah, right, you must be joking. So let's look at some examples. Moses, like, he stuttered, he wasn't really a good orator, and God was like, hey, go talk to all those people, and he was like, Esther was like a secret Jew. She was like super infiltrating of the kingdom. Jeremiah, he was like really young, he said it a lot. David, he was like a shrimp and like also young, and then Mary was a woman, which is like the worst. So we look at all these examples, and God is not calling on the most powerful people in the Bible. God is calling on the least of us. And while this is not a direct quotation, were I to venture a guess at what God might say about this, God would say, hey, these things you think make people worthy or unworthy don't actually matter to me, God. And so if we're looking at who God calls as God's prophets in the Bible, it totally queers, totally destabilizes what we believe makes someone worthy or unworthy. You would think God would pick all the smart, strong jocks who are gonna go into politics one day and probably like are really good at snowboarding and like all of these things that we think make people cool and worthy. That's not what our God is talking about.
The story of the calling of David is a great illustration of this, because I think 7 older brothers, Jesse has 8 sons, 7 older brothers for David, and God is like, you should go to Jesse's house. The next king will be there. Is one of Jesse's sons, and Jesse parades his sons in front of Samuel, like one by one, being like, is it this one? And Samuel goes, is it this one? And God goes, next. And so finally, well, Jesse's out of sons, so he's like, well, surely you have another one around here somewhere. I did get the address right, I checked. And he's like, oh, there's David. He's like watching the sheep.
He's like out in the field because he doesn't matter.
Yeah, like I couldn't even imagine that it would have been David. I didn't think to bring him up here. And Samuel goes down and says, this one guy goes, yes, anoint him. And it says he was small, and he's like, are you sure? And he goes, men look upon the body, but the Lord looks upon the heart.
It's queer. All right, so there's some examples of God in the Bible. But let's talk about Jesus. This is one of, I think, the most brilliant things that Logan has ever come up with. So I worship a God who took human form, but queered the lines between human and divine, queered the divide between death and life, queered the divide between clean and unclean. Gender is small potatoes after all of that. But truly, if we believe in a God that is destabilizing all of these like really fixed things like being dead, for instance, how much of a jump is it for us to worship a God who doesn't believe in fixed either this or that gender roles? Not that hard for me. So, in the very nature of who Jesus reveals himself to be, he is showing us that he is a God, that God is a God of not fixed boundaries. Jesus also reveals this in the way that in what he is teaching to people. Somebody feel called to read Mark chapter 3 verses 1 to 6? Anybody? Want to read out loud for us? Thank you.
Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, or to save a life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Now the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus.
Thank you. So based on what we've been talking about, if to look through a queer lens, to destabilize boundaries we believe to be fixed, in what way might you understand Jesus queering something in the world in this passage? Anybody?
Well, at this time in this context, it was completely wrong for you to do really anything on the Sabbath, and it still is today. And so that the fact that Jesus would heal somebody on the Sabbath and do nothing, do that is just completely preposterous to them.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else? In a way, to me also, Jesus is queering our perceptions of power. So here we have the Pharisees who are like, yeah, we're Pharisees. We get to make all the rules about everything and enforce them. Jesus is saying, no, you don't have the power to dehumanize someone. You don't have the power to say, yes, this is what we do, this is what we don't do. We're going to give the power back to God, and you are not allowed to police those boundaries anymore. And I'm going to look towards the least of these, the people with the least amount of power, and say, I will turn towards you, not towards the ones given, the ones endowed with power by society.
So for me, and I'm wearing the queer lens that I can't help but wear most of the time. They remain silent. That says something. There's eons in that silence, right? Because they don't answer his question with what they've already said. You know, like, how dare you? So if they were being honest, if they were just going to answer back, well, they'd say, well, no, it's the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath. Instead, they remain silent, which to me, and this is for me, it says Jesus has struck a nerve. Jesus has said the Sabbath is for the life-affirming purposes of God. The Sabbath is God, and you're doing it wrong because you make it about rules and not about life. They don't have a response to that, but their silence says, my lens is more important.
So this means something really important for us as Christians. If we're looking at God, if we're looking at the Bible, if we're looking at God and Jesus and who they tell us they are through creation and through the Bible, that means something for us. Jesus was about destabilizing boundaries. Jesus was about agitating these institutions that we believe to be fixed. Jesus was about queering us into a new understanding of what it means to be human. And this isn't just like a cool, funky idea that like these weird people from California are sitting up here and telling you. Instead, it has real implications in your life and the way in which you might, in turn, go and, using a queer lens, destabilize and agitate in a lot of sections of your life.
So we've talked mainly about two ways. So identifying and resisting harmful norms and assumptions. It's paying attention to the sunglasses and using them when it's appropriate and discarding them when they're scratched, when they're broken, when they're harmful, when they're giving you a headache. So a harmful norm. There are two human pronouns, third person, singular, he and she, and you can easily identify what someone uses by looking at them. If I look at you, I know what you need. I know how to talk about you. That's not true. I'm just going to tell you that that's not true. And not everyone uses he and she, myself included. So a way to resist that is to just ask people for pronouns. Just like, hi, I'm Logan. I use he, here, ears today. What pronouns do you use? Or you're running a small group, right? You say, let's talk about who we are, where we're from, our favorite ice cream flavor, and what pronouns we prefer. Simple as that, resisting this harmful idea that there are two genders, two ways to talk about genders, and that you can tell what someone is by looking at them. Or maybe assuming that everyone is straight, or just assuming that you know what kind of people someone is attracted to. So do you have a boyfriend? It can actually be a loaded question, right? Because you're assuming something about that person. You could say, do you have a sweetie? Do you have a special someone? No, that's not. We went over a way to, resisting an idea that God is male or something like that. You can say, practice different ways of using pronouns for God. There are all kinds of ways that we just identify these norms in our lives and think, well, how do I resist this? How do I work in a life-affirming way? And this gets into opening up space because affirming life is what God's about. Bonhoeffer said, the glory of God is revealed in a human being fully alive. And what does it mean to be fully alive? These structures, these ideas, these lenses, some of them can be good, but some of them are voices that actually pull us away from our full self. Like, maybe I am called to be the most fabulous figure skater that has ever skated. Maybe that is my ministry, but I'm a macho guy, and guys aren't supposed to figure skate, and I never finished that goal, that dream. But God was calling me to that, That can limit me. That kind of idea of policing of my own gender identity can limit me. Something as simple as ordaining women. How many women are called to ordained ministry today and in the past? And how many of them were not able to live out in the fullness of their being God's call to them? God is calling us to be full and alive selves, completely radiant in God's image. And so when we open up these spaces, we start paying attention to what lenses we're working through, what voices we're paying attention to. Is this the voice of something that's going to harm me? Is this the voice of something that harms somebody else? Or is this the voice of God calling me into the fullness of my being?
And in this way, what we're doing is the work of the kingdom. And that's a really nebulous term that we throw around a lot in the church, but I believe that it is living into the lives Jesus modeled for us and the lives that Jesus called us to. So just like Logan was saying, using a queer lens can help you be critical of the voices that are speaking at you and to discern maybe those are the voices of false prophets. Those aren't the voice. Those are not the voice of the God who created you. And it also helps us be critical of doing the work of the kingdom and what you're saying, well, okay to. So what you're being complicit with, whether because you realize it or you don't realize it, you're allowing to happen in the world, which is not only, like Logan said, dehumanizing someone else, but in that complicit dehumanization of someone else, you yourself are not being allowed to live into the fullness of who God created you to be.
So, a note on that, like, so the idea, the phrase no purpling, we've already said, is basically complicit in assuming that people are straight and in assuming that there are two genders. That doesn't mean that people who've used or continue to use the phrase no purpling like don't like queer people or don't like gay people. You don't have to like have malicious intent to be complicit, to say okay to an idea that you might not even agree with that harms someone. So that's an important thing to realize.
Well, it's what we always do, and it's probably fine, right? Like, it doesn't really matter that much. But using a queer lens allows you to be critical of that. And finally, as we were mentioning, what messages of authority are you internalizing and listening to? Is it the voices of normative perspective that society has chosen, like I said, based on the way history is shaken out? Or is it the voice of the creator of the universe, which, just venturing a guess, might open up a lot more possibilities than how you understand yourself as God's creation?